Hi, and welcome back to the Room Live tonight. We've got a pretty special evening tonight. We're doing a pre-book launch party for a book that's coming out in HarperCollins in January of 2010, or next year. The book is called The Only Thing Worth Dying For, and we're here with the author, Eric Blehm. Eric's last book, The Last Season, was named by Outside Magazine one of the top adventure autobiographies ever, one of the top 10 adventure autobiographies ever. And we're here with Major Jason Amerine, who is a major, not really a character, but a major player in the book. So why don't we start with you, Eric? Tell us, set up the story for us, and kind of tell us what this book is about to you.
Well, The Only Thing Worth Dying For is really a modern day Lawrence of Arabia, if you want to just kind of place it in a small package. But if you could just transport yourself back to 9/11, 2001, and at that time when we were all sitting in our living rooms wondering what we were going to do as a nation in response to the terrorist attacks. There were war planners trying to figure out a way to get into Afghanistan, a landlocked country where everyone was aware that Osama bin Laden was based. At that time, there was literally no plan for Afghanistan. All these years of understanding that Osama bin Laden was the biggest terrorist threat to our nation, we still had not put together a plan to invade Afghanistan if we ever had to go in and get to him. At the time, we looked at a couple different options, conventional warfare and unconventional warfare, and it became evident that the best way to go after him would be to use small teams of men to go in and join up with the Northern Alliance fighters who had been fighting the Taliban for many years. This book is a little bit interesting and very unique in that all of the teams that went to the north, their main mission was really to go in and get the Taliban, kill the Taliban, and use them to get to the Al-Qaeda terrorists. In the south, which was considered the Taliban heartland, there were no standing armies, there were no fiefdoms where they could retreat to, where Americans were. There was literally no contacts with the CIA, from the CIA in the south. But we really knew that you had to go with the Pashtun tribal belt, which was based in the south, which is where the Taliban had arisen from. ODA 574, or Operational Detachment Alpha 574, often popularly known as an A-team of Green Berets, was tasked with the one mission to go into the south and try and foment a rebellion among the Pashtun. And in doing so, the idea was push towards Kandahar and ultimately force the Taliban to surrender.
So, Jason, tell me how is Afghanistan structured in the sense where I know that the Taliban is Pashtun and Karzai, I believe, is Pashtun as well, but yet we sent, and if I'm correct, they're the largest tribe in Afghanistan, but we sent all of our troops to the north, but yet we weren't in the south yet. And this is, the time frame we're talking about is October 2001, right after 9/11.
Well, in 2001, after the September 11th attacks, the U.S. looked at Afghanistan, and we had a pretty clear mission in mind. It was eradicate al-Qaeda. To do that, initially, we're willing to negotiate with the Taliban, but the Taliban weren't willing to negotiate with us. They really, I don't think, believed that we had the will to actually invade the country. So, as we looked at Afghanistan, there were several options on how to invade. One was a conventional approach, similar to what the Soviets had done, but we also knew how that had failed. The other approach was to work with the minority ethnic groups there. Afghanistan is composed mainly of Uzbek, Tajik, Hazara minorities, with the Pashtun that make up the majority ethnic group, about 40% of the population. The Northern Alliance was a alliance of Uzbek, Tajik, and Hazara who had formed small fiefdoms in the north under what we refer to as warlords today, warlords like Dostum and others. So the easiest way for us to go about toppling the Taliban with the fewest American troops on the ground was to link up special forces teams with the Northern Alliance and basically help them to fight the Taliban. The Northern Alliance, from their enclaves, had fought the Taliban to a stalemate. the Taliban had control over the majority of the country, but the Northern Alliance had their small enclaves. And what we hoped to do was insert teams of the Northern Alliance, get them to work with one another. They had a notoriously fragmented command structure where they had a lot of difficulty working with one another due to a lot of distrust. So we hope to get them to work together, provide air support and supplies, and then the Northern Alliance would reclaim the northern part of Afghanistan, their traditional tribal lands. Then they come south in the Pashtun tribal belt where the Taliban ruled from Kandahar.
And explain to me, what are the Special Forces and what is a Special Forces team? And is there a difference between Special Forces and Green Berets?
There's often a lot of confusion about the terminology, Special Forces. Special Operations is the wide umbrella that includes Rangers, SEALs, Delta, basically all the special purpose units that people know about. The term Special Forces specifically applies to the organization I was with. The nickname is Green Berets, but the proper terminology is Special Forces. So it's easy to get them confused. You'll usually hear people talk about Special Forces when they really mean Special Operations. Special Forces was created in the 1950s, really with a focus of infiltrating in a war against the Soviet Union to assist the various satellite states of the Soviet Union in rising up and forming partisans and fighting the Soviets from within. That's what we're created for, guerrilla warfare. The first widespread use of Special Forces was in Vietnam, where working alongside Vietnamese units as well as other minority groups in South Vietnam, we fought counterinsurgency there. We used Special Forces in various conflicts since then, but what was unique about the invasion of Afghanistan was it was the first time that Special Forces was actually made the main effort, not in a supporting role to any conventional units or other units.
And so, who's Hamid Karzai, Eric? And how did he get involved in all of this?
Well, Hamid Karzai, the perception of Hamid Karzai is much different today than it was in 2001. In 2001, he was a patriot to Afghanistan. He came from the Popolazai tribe, which was a high, well-recognized tribe within the Pashtun tribal belt. His father had been the chief of the Popolazai, and recently, only 2 years before 9/11, or actually a year before, his father had been assassinated by what they presumed were Al-Qaeda agents in Quetta, Pakistan. Hamid Karzai was a member of the large family. He had 7 brothers and sisters, obviously very wealthy. After the Soviet occupation, they all fled Afghanistan to calmer locations around the world to become businessmen, businesswomen, have their families in a safe area. Hamid, who was not the oldest, he was the second to the youngest in the family, actually stayed in the area and aided the Mujahideen against the Soviets. And so he got a lot of respect from his fellow tribesmen because he didn't use his wealth and his high status as a shield of safety. He really did stay involved and wanted to do what was best for Afghanistan. Fast forward a few years, and he was instrumental in warning the United States and other countries about the Taliban, about the human atrocities going on before 9/11, and also about the terrorist organizations that were making Afghanistan their home base. So come 9/11, he was actually in Jalalabad, Pakistan, getting ready to meet with U.S. embassies and I think the embassy for the UK when the attacks actually occurred. And what he was doing at the time was, again, trying to pound his drum and warn us about the terrorist threat in Afghanistan. That's what he was at the time. And essentially, he took it upon himself after 9/11 to go back into southern Afghanistan and again tried to single-handedly on a couple of motor scooters with unarmed friends to go in and tell the Pashtun, it's time to rise up. The eyes of the world are upon us. Let's rise up against the Taliban and push them out from within. And that really is Hamid Karzai that I came to know when I was researching and trying to keep my story focused on the time period of those few weeks and months right after 9/11.
So Jason, you guys got assigned this mission. How did that occur, and what was the mission you were assigned? And take us into linking up with Karzai.
All the teams in 5th Group were just aching to deploy for the invasion of Afghanistan. Pretty much by luck. I think my team was about the 6th or 7th into Uzbekistan. The plan was to form a base in Uzbekistan, and from there we would infiltrate the teams in northern Afghanistan and work with the Northern Alliance. So my team was just sort of next in line. The first couple teams got in. We're having a lot of difficulty because of the weather, also limitations on our helicopters themselves because of the altitudes. So there was just a lot of difficulty getting the war started. So as we're waiting to see what mission we might draw, we're actually initially told that we'd be linking up with a Pashtun named Abdul Haq. Abdul Haq was a mujahideen. He'd fought the Soviets. Pretty well-known fighter. So we were put on alert, get ready to go into southern Afghanistan and start an uprising in the Pashtun tribal belt, which definitely gave us a start because we didn't have anything down in the south. So we'd be starting from scratch, and that definitely made it a more complicated mission. Literally within hours, we're told Abdul Haq was captured and executed by the Taliban. So we sort of regrouped, contemplated that we were about to go down there, and he was captured and executed. And then we're told, okay, new mission for you. Some guy named Hamid Karzai, same thing, wants to stir up trouble in the Pashtun tribal belt. So, we looked over what little information we had. We honestly didn't really know anything about him other than his intention of going into the south. So at that point, basically, we linked up with him. I'll just call it a secret location, and that was where, in working with Hamid, one-on-one, really. I mean, it was me and him with a couple of guys from my team. We developed a plan on how to start an insurgency among the Pashtun to force the Taliban to abdicate the government in Kandahar. Karzai's vision was pretty simple. If we could work with him in southern Afghanistan, we'd give him the credibility that he had U.S. support. We could also provide arms and ammo so that he himself could raise an army and basically build his own credibility as a fighter. And from there, he would rally all the Pashtun tribes, getting them to join his cause. In his words, the Pashtun were ready to rise up. They hated the Taliban. They wanted the Taliban gone, but they needed some kind of leadership, some kind of unifying force within the tribal belt so the tribes could stand up together against the Taliban. So the mission was work with him in southern Afghanistan, raise an army, and there were really just two cities that we needed to seize in order to end the Taliban regime in the south. First city was Tarankot, which was right in the heartland of where a lot of the Taliban leadership came from. Mullah Omar was from a city not far from Tarankot. So what Karzai wanted us to do is work with him in a location not far from Tarankot, raise an army, arm it, and then we would lay siege to Tarankot. Once Tarankot fell, we'd raise a bigger army and make our way down to Kandahar, which was about a 15-hour drive south of Tarankot. And once we got there, forced the Taliban to surrender, because at that time, the Taliban leadership was really working out of Kandahar, not Kabul. So it was two cities that we needed to seize, and then that would be the end of the fight in the south. The big factor, though, that he warned us about, the Northern Alliance was winning. The Northern Alliance on its own had pretty well consolidated its tribal lands in the north, and they're getting ready to come south. The big danger, though, is if the Northern Alliance came south, then we're afraid there's going to be a civil war. So really our bigger mission was to prevent a civil war by forcing the Taliban, who were Pashtun, to surrender to the Pashtun. And in so doing, we keep the Northern Alliance in the north. The Pashtun would take care of a Pashtun problem in the south, and that would be the end of the war at that stage.
Isn't Karzai's Pashtun and the Taliban's Pashtun, and wasn't he a part of the Taliban at one point?
I mean, you know, with all your research, you'd probably talk to it better than I could in terms of his background. I mean, initially, what I'll say in a broad stroke is that the majority of the Pashtun really welcomed the Taliban because there had been a civil war raging. And when the Taliban first rose up, they were sort of national heroes for ending the lawlessness and for trying to bring order to the country. So at their inception, they appeared to be a good idea. All the religious extremism, all the tyranny that followed just, you know, wasn't really in the playbook initially. They were going to end a civil war that came from a power vacuum after the Soviets withdrew. And it was a civil war among all the ethnic groups that, I mean, logically the Pashtun were going to win. They had the numbers, they had the strength. And the Taliban were that Pashtun movement that promised to bring peace. They brought peace, but it came at a horrible cost. Karzai initially, along with you know, the majority of the Pashtun, supported what the Taliban were trying to achieve. But then as the Taliban became more and more extreme, that was where the Taliban lost the support of people like Karzai and others, and Karzai became an expatriate. But you might be able to speak to some of that in better detail.
Yeah, Karzai had based himself out of Quetta, Pakistan, and at the time, the Taliban had asked him if he would be an ambassador, or sort of a spokesperson for the Taliban to the UN early on, when the UN still recognized Afghanistan or the Taliban as a legitimate government in the Afghan state. After Karzai started to see a couple of things happen. First, he started to see foreigners influencing the the Taliban government. Anything from the terrorists, the Arabs as the broad definition at the time, but various terrorist groups, as well as Pakistan, the ISI, their intelligence group. He started feeling that the Taliban weren't necessarily there to keep the peace and push Afghanistan towards a peaceful future. They really turned around and started doing things that were really what Karzai felt were to keep themselves in power. And again, the extreme radical religion and, you know, closing down the schools, not allowing, you know, kites to be flown and music. That was when he finally kind of put his foot down. He left, went to Pakistan, and started to kind of quietly at first speaking against the Taliban and warning other countries of what was going on in the country. And that was really when his name became mud, and if anything, he became a marked man by the Taliban. Obviously, his father was killed, and his father was preaching for Loya Jirga, which is ground council that would help lead the country in more of a somewhat of a democratic system. With Karzai following in the footsteps of his father, he was still considered a threat to the Taliban, and again, that leads us right up to 9/11, and he was preaching against the Taliban government at that time.
So let's go back to that. And how many teams were in the South at the time? How many ODA teams were in the South?
There weren't any teams in the South initially. All of our focus was in the Northern Alliance. And we were hoping that we could start something in the South, in the Pashtun tribal belt. But what we were doing in the North was working. There was a lot of controversy as to whether it was really worth risking lives to put anybody in the South. And that was where my team was given the responsibility of figuring out who Karzai was and if it was really worth the risk. And after working with him for about a week and a half, we determined we respected him and we trusted him. So we thought we'd give it a try.
And so let's talk about your team. I want you'd actually take this question because you did a lot of research and you went out and talked to team members and family members. And who is ODA 574?
It's interesting because we all have this perception of special forces. Again, we kind of covered that. The special operations community are considered the door kickers. They're the direct action folks who you will see a takedown, planning for a takedown. There'll be an airfield somewhere and you'll have satellite images and you'll have a detailed plan of these different groups that will go in with heavy armaments, bombing in advance, and take down an objective. Well, the special forces are often considered the thinking man army. You know, they go in, and their job really is to go into situations where there is no plan, and they work off of the intelligence they gather on the spot, on the ground, and they, as scary as it may seem, they were told, get in on the ground and work it out, see what you can do. And these men on ODA 574 were really a cross-section of America. I mean, from towns from Hawaii to California, St. Louis, Watauga, Tennessee, all across the country. And you look at them, you look at the pictures of them, and they're not Rambo. They look like a bunch of ordinary guys. I mean, you don't see them all as being these individuals who you might, you know, see with a machine gun, you know, with the war paint, whatnot. Again, they are the thinking man team. They go on the ground and they really do try and work it out. Each team consists of a group of different specialists. They're led by an officer, a captain, and there's a warrant officer. There's 12 men total. There's 2 weapons sergeants, 2 communications sergeants. There's a senior and a junior. There's an intelligence officer, or an intelligence sergeant, and an engineer, expert in demolitions and whatnot. So they, together, each of them has a different aspect that will be used to not only finish their mission, but also to, you know, protect each other and follow through with whatever they come up with on the ground. There's also a medic, by the way, a medical sergeant as well. They're all cross-trained, and they're really just a small group of men who are trained to go into any situation, figure it out, lay siege to towns, but also to win the hearts and minds of the locals. And in guerrilla warfare or an insurgency, that really is key. And in this case, in particular, it was extremely important because there was no backup on the ground. There was no Northern Alliance. If anything went wrong, the only people they could run to were the Pashtun they were surrounded by. And no one really understood who was friend and who was foe. There was huge amounts of money put up by the Taliban for an American uniform. There was a price on Karzai's head, and they all went in on the ground. And with Karzai, with really nothing more than his assurance that the Pashtun were ready to rise up. So it was you know, hearing it from the outside, it was a very harrowing and dangerous mission. But to hear these guys talk about it in person, they just talk about it like it's a walk, was a walk in the park. They just take it in stride, and they use humor, black humor often just to kind of relax and see how it unfolds. And that really is ODA 574. They were the masters at just relaxing and seeing what they can do once they're on the ground. Very little planning.
So who was ODA 574, Jason?
ODA 574 was a military freefall team. So the team's specialty was what would somewhat look like skydiving. You know, parachuting from 12 to 18,000 feet under oxygen. That was a means of infiltration. Then getting in on the ground and you know, fighting unconventional warfare missions. The men on my team were some of the most senior NCOs in the battalion. My team sergeant, Jefferson Davis, who's from Tennessee, had been a medic, rose through the ranks, and became a team sergeant. I mean, he was the team's father. He earned the nickname Gray Wolf when we were training the Kazakhs in counterinsurgency operations during the year prior to 9/11. Just great man. Everybody had a lot of respect for him. Very calm leader, very fatherly. I mean, all of us looked up to him. His right-hand man, you know, sort of the third in command of the team, was Gil Magalinas, who was our intel sergeant. Mag was really at the point where he was ready to take a team of his own. He was a senior sergeant first class, very experienced, very hard charging. Mag was a gutsy guy. As we'd be looking at the mission and trying to figure out how to develop it, what to do, Mag had the confidence of a Green Beret who'd seen it and done it. He'd climb mountains. I mean, he'd been all over the world. He'd been in Pakistan quite a bit. I mean, he was somebody who was definitely ready for the mission and was somebody we could lean on. I had 3 weapons sergeants, which was unusual, but it was just because of the way things were as we were rushing to get out the door to fight the war. Ronnie Rakes was really the most senior of them, and the quiet professional. Like Gil, a very competent NCO, but at the same time, just kind of quiet, would always stand back. He was one of those guys where when he was in the room, it would kind of calm everything down no matter how umped up we got. He'd always kind of step in and with a calm southern drawl kind of tell all of us to chill out. I mean, just an awesome guy. Another one of my weapons sergeants, Mike McKelney, I brought onto the team specifically because we were sort of rebuilding the team. We'd lost a lot of really good folks. So Mike had been stuck in staff for a while, and he was itching to get to a team. He was itching to actually get out in the field and do real work. So I think that after we'd been doing a lot of training for a while and the team was starting to get kind of tired, bringing Mike on kind of reinvigorated everything, because he was a guy that was sitting there definitely ready to point out all of our areas of weakness that we needed to improve on the team. He was somebody, as I say, handpicked to kind of come on board and help ramrod things as we're rebuilding. The rest of the team really just kind of followed suit with that. Dan Petitore was my commo sergeant, and Dan was amazing. He was known all across the SF community because he was just such a funny, dynamic guy. There'd be folks that were in a military school with him. He never even met him face to face, and they'd be coming up to him going, hey, you're Dan, I know all about you. Dan's job was commo, and it sounds simple, but this is a guy who could basically make commo with wire and some rocks strung together. I mean, he probably was one of the best commo sergeants in group. I mean, I had a very strong team. I mean, these were guys who had been in group for years. All they wanted to do was be in group. They wanted to be on teams. They loved jumping out of airplanes. I mean, it was really hard to keep up with them. I mean, I'd look at the team and I'd be thinking, how do I lead these guys? I mean, most of them were older than I was, a lot more experienced than I was. I mean, it really was a humbling experience to walk into the team room every day, let alone when we knew we were going to war and I was now responsible for taking them to combat.
So you had your team and you had to work in concert with Karzai. How did you gain his trust, or how did he gain your trust?
Well, it sounds kind of simple, but just spending time with him to me was the key. The training we go through to earn our beret, to earn our Special Forces tab is the Special Forces qualification course. And the one thing that they jammed into our heads was you stay with the G chief, the guerrilla leader, the guerrilla chief. And during the training, you would actually be yelled at if you wandered off and you kind of left that man's side, because the only way you're going to get to know him is by pretty much sitting there with him and getting to know him. So as I say, it's sort of a simple piece of advice, but what I did was I just made sure that I made myself available to him 24/7. I sat in on the tribal meetings. He would have to do the translating of what was going on for me because we didn't have any Pashtun speakers, and we were short translators, so he was our translator. So I would just sit there and, a lot of times I'd just drink tea for 8 hours and just try to follow what was going on, learn a lot about him from his insights. Watching tribal leaders argue is pretty entertaining because they'll fight over the smallest of things as they're trying to posture and they're trying to gain authority over one another. Karzai was at the head of the circle if you'll pardon that term. And he would sit there patiently as they're arguing over, who was going to get the next truck that we were going to buy. Things that were pretty petty. These fights would get heated. People would be yelling at one another. I mean, I'd sit there thinking that, shots were about to be fired. Karzai would kind of lean over, make some ironic comment about it to me, watch for a minute, and then just very quietly tell them, okay, stop. He's getting the truck. Next topic. And we'd move on from there. He was very well respected by all of our tribal leaders. He knew how the system worked. He understood tribal politics. He understood how to get them to work together. I think one of our bigger weaknesses was that Karzai had no second in command, but that was by design. Karzai couldn't have a second in command because it would have angered the other tribal leaders. So Karzai was in charge with no favored second in command. And that was just how he did business, but he exhausted himself doing it.
What did you learn about Karzai's team and the people that 574 was on the ground with?
About the guerrillas?
Mm-hmm.
I learned, first of all, that in the South, it was a militia. I mean, to a large extent, there was people that showed up when they would have their weapons drops. They would have, anything from AK-47s to machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades would come in on parachute, and they would come to pick these up. And there were men and sons that would show up with a donkey with pitchforks. It was to that extent. There's this perception of the Afghan warrior, of the Mujahideen, and these weren't the men, by and large, who Karzai had rallied. As one of the Green Berets told me, he said calling it a militia was really an improvement upon the reality of what we were up against. There were small groups of very well-trained, men who would have been considered Mujahideen, and they were very dedicated. And in one case, a man named Bari Gul, the team kind of considered them their security force. They were the one group that they knew wouldn't run from a fight. Because interestingly enough, after all their planning for this insurgency, they landed in the mountains of Uruzgan province, and their plan was to maybe in 6 months build a militia, train an army, and then take siege to Tarankot, where Jason correctly called it a city, but really it was a little more than a town. It was 10,000 people. As they say, when the first bullet's fired, everything goes to hell. The people of Tarankot, after Karzai was on the ground with ODA 574, they rose up spontaneously and hung their Taliban provincial governor, and that changed everything. All of a sudden, ODA 574 was faced with a decision. We're supposed to be incognito, we're supposed to be hiding out in the mountains, raising this militia surreptitiously, and now all of a sudden they get word that there is 1,000 hardened Pakistani Taliban coming to Tarankot to put down this uprising. And what that means, they were going to slaughter people. They were going to hang them from their trees. They were going to kill women and children. And at that point, ODA 574 had to make a decision. Do we go and protect this town? Do we go in with the few people that Karzai does have behind him? Or do we get helicoptered out of here and get Karzai out of here? Well, of course, Karzai was unwilling to leave because he had urged everybody to rise up, and he didn't want to leave their side, and ODA 574 was in the same position. So they rode in kind of a haphazard ragtag convoy from this little village where they were going to build this army, and took the fight to the enemy. And at that point, there were 30 people. They wanted to have ultimately around 300. And at that point, they would have brought in additional ODAs to raise, build a larger army. Again, it was interesting to see these few men on ODA 574 and these few guerrillas right outside of town, set up a position with around 1,000 people. They reckoned hardened fighters coming towards them, and some of them literally had been taught okay, this is an AK-47, the bullets come out of this end. So they were farmers, they were, you know, I guess you could say peasants and whatnot. So it was really a ragtag force, and it was pretty amazing that they put it together and they faced this large group of hardened fighters.
So what happened on the ground?
Which day?
Well, you had a 6-month mission
Right.
that ended in 3 weeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did it end so quickly? And how were you able to, one team of guys and 30, as you said, ragtag locals?
There's more to that as well, but we'll go into that. These 30 men that were lined up with ODA 574, when this large convoy of Taliban came rushing through this mountain pass, at that point the team had brought in air power, and they had called in bombs and basically let the aircraft go, cleared them hot to take out the convoy. Well, the first bomb landed short of the lead vehicle in this Taliban retribution force, and the guerrillas immediately saw this, not understanding the idea of American air power, not understanding that, you know, bombs do miss, but that doesn't mean this battle's over. Anyways, they turned around and they jumped in their trucks and they fled. They went and to leave ODA 574 on their own, and then again they had to make this decision. Do we jump in these trucks and return to the town and set up another defensive position, or do we stand our ground here? Well, there really was no question. Jason could probably take it from there.
Yeah, it was definitely not the fight that we were hoping to have, but you know, it's not too often you get to pick and choose your battles. Our guidance from our commander was don't infiltrate unless Karzai has 300 men. But we're put in a difficult position because Karzai made it clear he wouldn't be able to raise 300 men unless we got on the ground with him. So I basically had to convince my chain of command to let us go in anyway. We get in on the ground, we drop weapons, ammo, hundreds of guerrillas come out of the mountains, take the weapons, and leave. You know, and so, you know, day 2 on the ground, we have about, you know, 30, 40 guerrillas, and that's it. Our goal, as Eric had discussed, was to seize Turncoat. And Turncoat spontaneously rises up, hangs its mayor, and tells us, come take the town. You know, we're here, they want Karzai to occupy. We knew a fight was coming, and it was going to be, you know, my team with, you know, a couple dozen guerrillas trying to defend the town against thousands of Taliban down in Kandahar that were going to want to come retake it. It was pretty awful spot to be in because, you know, I had to come to grips with the fact that my boss had said don't go in unless he has 300. I convinced him to let us go in without 300, and now we're about to face a big army with just a couple dozen guys trying to help us. And it was, you know, I viewed it as it was my fault that we were in that position. At the same time, though, we didn't have any choice. We had to try to defend the town. I mean, it seemed like it was pretty much a losing bet, but we did what we could. So we grabbed what few militia we had, rode to the outskirts of Turncoat, and you know, as expected, 1,000 Taliban came for the town. The guerrillas weren't trained. It wasn't their fault. They weren't really guerrillas yet. You know, they weren't even militia yet. They were just a bunch of locals with weapons that were trying to be helpful. And they ran. All we could do is retreat to Turncoat with them, where Karzai was trying to get more men. Karzai sees us racing into town, asks us what's going on. And we tell him, okay, they ran. We need to get back out there. You know, he says, well, what do you need? We're taking these 2 trucks and we're leaving. You know, to get back out and keep directing bombs on the Taliban. Karzai said, okay, go, go, go. JD, one of the phrases that he liked to say a lot was, drive it like you stole it. And we had to physically remove our guerrillas from the trucks. They were actually their trucks, but Karzai kept them calm as we basically stole their trucks and got ready to ride out of town. I looked at Wes McGurr, one of my guys. I'm like, "You want to drive?" He said, "Fuck yeah." We got in the trucks and drove out of town. When we got outside of Terncoat, the Taliban had already kind of seized the initial position we were on, this just terrific ridgeline. It was a good area to defend Terncoat with, and now we're literally right outside of town. We lined up our trucks, called for all the air support we could, F-18s and F-14s from the Navy, and it was a long trip for them to get to our position, so we're awful lonely there. The first aircraft dropped their bombs and left, and we're just sitting there outside of town, 2 trucks, hundreds of bad guys coming for us, and all we could do is wait for air support to arrive. A first wave of aircraft finally did arrive. Alan, he's an Air Force combat controller assigned to my team, put him to work on the convoy. And they dropped a lot of bombs, but the convoy wouldn't turn back. It kept coming. Aircraft ran out of bombs. They knew it was desperate. One of the pilots calls down to us, trying to identify our position. We tell them, "Okay, do you see the 2 trucks right here?" "Yeah, those are all the friendlies." And pilot says, "That's it?" The pilots didn't know what the air defense threat was. They thought that the Mujahideen, who'd been armed with Stinger missiles when they were fighting the Soviets, might have still had them. So they normally stayed pretty high in the air, but they knew it was so desperate that they called for permission to strafe and basically dropped altitude to pretty close to the deck and started strafing the convoy just to use up what ammo they had left. Then they were out of bombs and ammo, and all they could do is leave and wish us luck. And at that point, again, we found ourselves all alone with a lot of Taliban coming our way. Then something kind of funny started to happen. The people of Terncoat, not sent by Karzai, just the locals started to come outside and started to wander out into the streets and surround our trucks. I mean, it almost looked like carnival in the streets. Kids were coming over playing with our antennas. Older folks are coming around trying to talk to us. We didn't really speak the language. I mean, meanwhile, there are plumes of black smoke from all the trucks we've bombed. We know the Taliban are getting closer. We start to try to push the crowd away, and then we realize a lot of them were armed. And at that point, my men realized, wait a minute, let's get these guys to help. So they started to organize, literally locals that just stepped outside with firearms and kind of set up a rough perimeter on our part of the town. And all around the town, the locals started doing the same. When the convoy finally was getting pretty close to the town, for me, once the Taliban got into the town, it was over. My team wasn't going to be able to fight them out of the streets, and we couldn't use air support to bomb them once they were in the town. So it was getting pretty close to time to go get Karzai. We'd done what we could. And then the last group of aircraft arrived. At that point, everything in theater had finally caught up to us, and we put them to work on the convoy. Problem was the convoy was so close to town that they were about to really make it. As I say, if they made it in a town, it was over. We couldn't use the aircraft anymore. And as we spotted Taliban trucks getting close to town, small arms fire opened up, sounds of AK-47s. And initially, we weren't sure who was shooting at who. We didn't know if the Taliban were shooting at the town, and then we realized the town was shooting at the Taliban. The town had come out to help, and as the Taliban made it pretty well to the gates of the city, the townspeople themselves started fighting the Taliban back. So between the aircraft that we directed and the townspeople, we turned the convoy back by probably about mid-morning, and the Taliban were in full retreat. The battle's effect was psychologically devastating to the Taliban. The Taliban had no idea we were there. They had no idea that Karzai was there. But the effect of the battle was that these just crazy stories spread across the tribal belt. Thousands of Pashtun militia fighting off the Taliban, Karzai leading his men heroically in the streets. I mean, you know, there were stories of us running around with, you know, a machine gun in each hand doing all this crazy stuff, things that didn't really happen. But it told us that everything Karzai had said about the Pashtun wanting to be led, the Pashtun wanting to believe in some kind of an anti-Taliban movement in the South, it was really coming true. Karzai would tell me a couple days later that a bunch of religious leaders, mullah, had come to see him, and he thought that they were going to come to complain about, you know, Karzai's presence, the presence of Americans. And instead they said, if you and the Americans weren't here, we'd all be dead now. So that one battle really established Karzai's reputation as, you know, more than some random statesman who was working out of Pakistan. You know, now he was a fighter who'd had a big victory. And from there, we'd have to spend the next couple of weeks trying to hold on to the town because we still only had a few dozen guerrillas, and we had to figure out clever ways to secure turncoat in the area around us. But that's, I guess, where I'll stop for now.
So, Eric, let me ask you this: Why did Jason feel the need to convince his superiors to go in when they only had 30 and they needed 300? Why do you think he did it?
I would say Jason, Captain Amerine at the time, and his men, there's a great deal of idealism in what they stand for. I mean, the motto of Special Forces is De Oppresso Liber, which translates to free the oppressed. And as he got to know Karzai in this location, the secret location, which is we talk about in the book, it's too hard to describe right here, but he understood that, or actually he was able to convince Amerine, because here Amerine, he's a 30-year-old captain. Here's a risky mission. One of the CIA guys, when they said they were going to go in to take Turncoat, his response was, well, we need to bring a couple of platoons of Rangers. We need, you know, kind of like we're going to need a bigger boat kind of thing. But I think the real reason why is because he believed, and it just made sense. Karzai wanted to have this group behind him, and the Pashtun were ready to rise up. But again, they were very well versed, for instance, for the first Gulf War, when the leaflets came in and to the Kurds and said, you know, rise up against Saddam and we will support you. Well, we didn't support them afterwards, and then Saddam, after we left Kuwait and everything, they came and slaughtered the Kurds. So they actually stated that. One of the mullahs brought that up to Karzai when he was on the ground, and he said, you know, we need the presence, the flesh and blood presence of American soldiers by your side, like you have up in the north, like you're doing in the north, because they understood that was going on. Without that, we're not going to commit, because we don't know if you're going to stick around. And again, Jason recognized that, his men recognized that, and they felt it was a good mission. In fact, JD, or Jefferson Davis, before they got on the helicopters to go in on the mission, he came up to Jason and he told him, he said, sir, you know, I don't, in the past I haven't had a lot of respect for, you know, the warlord idealism. You know, we saw that in Somalia, the disregard for human life. He was extremely still shaken up over 9/11, and he said, either he's really pulling the wool over our eyes, or this guy Karzai is something different. But he said, overall, I feel it's a good mission. And I think what he was doing when he said that to Jason was kind of letting him know, hey, we don't know what's going to go down with this mission and when we land, but I want you to know that I, as your team sergeant, believe in this mission. I think we're doing the right thing. And there really was a lot of that with each of the men. They all really did truly believe in that ethic of freeing the oppressed. And it's something that, again, you don't. When I started interviewing the people, you might envision, some people might envision these bloodthirsty soldiers, but in reality, their fathers, their brothers, their sons, they have kids, and they look at these Afghan children in the villages and they say, you know, they want a better life for them as well. And I think that is a big part of what was different about Special Forces and their mission in the South. They're not just fighting to, in retribution to Al-Qaeda to go kill the terrorists, they're also fighting for Afghanistan. So this was a mission for Afghanistan and America, and they truly believed it was the right mission at the time.
There was something in the book that fascinated me, was about how information flowed. And again, getting back to that trust factor of you, Karzai's men, your men, and it almost seemed like it was whispers from tribe to tribe, from town to town, was how information flowed. And so how do you make a decision like that to go into, to take the next step in a mission that you're there to accomplish, but you didn't have all of the goods that you needed to accomplish it? How do you find the basis for making that decision?
Well, I think that there are two things that are key to that. I mean, the first is we trusted Karzai. Eric had mentioned Bari Ghul. Bari Ghul and his men, after the Battle of Tarankot arrived, Bari Ghul missed the battle because he was just trying to get his men from a remote area. So we had Bari Ghul, we had his 20-odd men, and they became part of the team. So that gave us a sense of security. Karzai's word was his bond. We trusted that. The other part of it, though, was as a team, we trusted each other. In Tarankot, even when things were at their worst, I had no doubt that I was going to get my team out of there and we're going to get out of there alive. I mean, we were trained. We'd worked through all the contingencies. We had a pretty solid plan for getting out of there. We had multiple layers of plans if things really went to crap. So I think at its core, I trusted that my team had my back. Everybody trusted that we had one another's backs on the team. So if things really got bad, at least the 11 of us could get out of there. But then built onto that was, trusting Karzai and trusting Bari Ghul. And that gave me a pretty good sense of security. A lot of us joked after that we, in many ways, slept better in Tarankot during our weeks there than we did back at home because we'd get a full night's sleep. We felt safe. And it's what we do, though. It's the basis of our training is that you aren't going to have every answer. It's going to be a lot more art than science. And this is coming from professionals where we talk about military science, where we want things to be very regimented. You want to have your fighting positions dug in a certain way and a perimeter, blah, blah, blah. But in Special Forces, you really just have to live with the chaos of the moment and try to find enough elements there to give you a sense of security. So between our trust in ourselves and our trust in a couple of our key guerrilla counterparts, we felt pretty good.
How'd you guys handle it? The mission?
I think they handled it well. I mean, to me, I had it easy because I was the team leader responsible for making decisions. I mean, we were in a very precarious position just, hanging out in Taliban country in Uruzgan. And my men had to, basically have faith that I wasn't leading them all to their deaths. And to me, that took a lot of courage. There was definitely stress. There was definitely pressure. But I think that everybody handled it as best they could.
So what was the turning point in the war, in the mission, that allowed it to end so quickly, and the Taliban to surrender? Well,
we had two things going on at the same time. And they were sort of separate events, but they were complementary. On the one hand, the Northern Alliance, as I said, was consolidating their victory in the north, and they were wanting to come south. Meanwhile, we had our victory in Terncoat. We were raising a small militia in Terncoat, and all the tribes were joining our side. I mean, it really was, it was pretty amazing how the Pashtun tribal belt was just falling like dominoes and joining Karzai's cause. We still didn't really have many men, but the support for the Taliban was crumbling. As that was happening, Karzai was suddenly on the short list to become interim leader of the country. So we had two things that were going on. On the one hand, the Pashtun tribal belt was in open revolt against the Taliban, and the Taliban really was starting to realize this was the end, and they were sending feelers out to Karzai about surrender terms. Then on the other hand, the Bonn Conference was ready to select an interim leader, and there was a lot of politics going on in terms of who that would be. So we found ourselves in sort of a race. We only had a small army, if you even want to call it that, but the Taliban thought it was huge. The pressure was on the Taliban, so what we wanted to do was just move on Kandahar. I mean, the way we viewed it, the Taliban wouldn't think we're crazy enough to move on a city guarded by thousands with only a few hundred men. So we would sort of bluff the Taliban by just getting in our convoy and racing to Kandahar before they realized how small we were. Meanwhile, we were in danger of actually losing Karzai himself, because if he was actually selected to be the interim leader, it would have been really hard to take him to the fight. We're very conflicted. Our job wasn't to protect him. Our job was to really take him to the fight so we could force the Taliban surrender. So everything coalesced in Shawalikot. It was the site of our last engagements from December 3rd to December 5th, as we seized the town in order to establish a forward headquarters for Karzai that was just outside of Kandahar. And as I say, the purpose was get there fast so the Taliban thought that we had a huge army, be available for face-to-face negotiations for surrender, and meanwhile, Karzai had to deal with the politics of the Bonn Conference. On December 4th, after a couple days of fighting to take Shawalikot, we received word informally that Karzai is going to be the interim leader of the country. Later we found out that the Taliban were coming to surrender. So really everything ended on December 5th. The Taliban were surrendering and Karzai is being selected as the interim leader. What was interesting about all that to me, though, as I said, was they were, to a degree, independent events. You know, he was going to be selected as the interim leader, but we still had to make sure that the Taliban were truly going to surrender Kandahar. So it definitely made it complicated in the last couple of days. And that was effectively at the end of the mission. So on December 5th, as we were awaiting the Taliban delegation to arrive, I mean, it really was sort of, okay, this is the end of this part of the mission. And we weren't under any illusion. We knew that the next part of the mission would be counterinsurgency. The insurgents, us, were now going to be running the government. And the Taliban were now going to become insurgents. So we're getting ready for that flip on December 5th.
Unfortunately and horribly, a headquarters, person from the headquarters called in a 2,000-pound JDAM bomb mistakenly on ODA 574's position. And it was probably it was actually on the heels of another friendly fire incident at Mazar-e Sharif at the uprising at a prison up there that happened 2 weeks earlier, but it was the second friendly fire incident in the war. Both of them had been initiated, the bombs had been called in by headquarters groups that had been called in to co-locate and work on the ground with the ODAs. And ultimately it was the commanders of these headquarters groups that called in or authorized the bombing. and not all the men on the team came home.
What was that like? What was the day?
I mean, it was definitely, the worst days, or the worst day in the lives of probably everybody there. JD was killed, Dan Petitore was killed, a friend of mine on the headquarters, Cody Brosser, was killed. Everybody on my team was wounded. Number of the headquarters personnel were wounded as well. Bari Ghul and most of his men were killed. They were right under the impact of the bomb. I mean, you can't imagine that kind of, just horror and devastation until you've been a part of it. But if there's anything I remember most about that day, though, it was how everybody, even in the middle of such chaos, everybody was able to come together, and we're able to save a lot of lives that day. I mean, Mike McKelney and Gil Magalinas probably should have died that day, but because of just the swift response, we had some Delta Force guys that had arrived that day as well that were able to cordon off the area, and were able to use all of our own medical training to just try to stabilize casualties. Nobody's all that sure about the true numbers of Americans and Afghans wounded, but I mean, we're talking, at least 50 folks wounded from the bomb, maybe more, and we just went to work stabilizing everybody and trying to get medevac. The real heroes that day were from AFSOC, Air Force Special Operations. They were coming out of Pakistan, flew daylight across southern Afghanistan to get my men out and to get everybody out, the Afghans and the Americans. I mean, they basically flew, grabbed us, and were pretty much running out of fuel as they landed at Rhino, a Marine base that was established south of Kandahar. I mean, it was a horrible day. But at the same time, the heroics of especially the Air Force coming and getting us, I mean, they saved a lot of lives that day.
What did you learn writing this book, Eric?
As a writer, it's kind of hard for me to say this, but first I learned that you can't believe everything you read, because I had really followed this story from the beginning. There was this press conference after this occurred, and of course, the reporting, there was nobody there. There were no embedded media at that time in the war. There was nobody around, and the reports were so skewed and so inaccurate after I actually was able to sit down and interview the people who were there. And I realized that from here on out, when I started writing the book, I decided I'm not going to use any source material. I'm not going to cite anything previously published, because the few things right off the bat that I started to read about were discounted by the men. For instance, there were RPGs flying, and these guys had a machine gun in both hands, blowing off rounds, when really it hadn't happened. And in some cases, by respected journalists, Pulitzer Prize winners in some cases, who literally had embellished, what really happened according to the men on the ground. It's not to say that they didn't hear about it from somebody else, from somebody else, from somebody else. So I learned that you really do have to at least get one eyewitness who's there to at least, figure out a basis, and then from there you reach out, and then you can kind of take the hearsay, to back up what's already been told. But I just made it a point that I'm always going to make sure that I work with eyewitnesses to events, because you really can't trust anything previously reported. And this story is so different than what I have read about and what you can find. You can Google it all day and you'll find out some very, very different, varying events from memoirs from soldiers that were officers and whatnot. They had certain individuals at places where they weren't. They had just everything is so different. So that would be the biggest lesson. I definitely will forever use eyewitnesses only.
Kind of in closing, I keep going back to the team, and I keep going back to what's the purpose of special forces and who are they? And is there anything unique about this mission that sort of typifies who the special forces are and how they were able to pull this off? 11 men against essentially the Taliban in the South?
I was talking to my uncle once and just made the comment about how lucky we were, and he's a retired Navy officer, and he said something like, nonsense, luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And you know, and that's the thing, is that I can't tell you that my team was any better than any of the others. I mean, as a team leader, you always think your team's better than all the others, but there were great teams all over Afghanistan. I mean, the stories in the North were, you know, to me, every bit as interesting and harrowing, and the stuff they did was every bit as heroic. You know, when I look at this mission, to me, I see it as something that Special Forces was designed to do this in the 50s, and it was the first time that we're finally given an opportunity to sort of take the training wheels off and do what we'd spent, you know, almost 50 years training for. You know, and here we are after the September 11th attacks. I mean, I think a lot of people forget just how horrible those days were afterwards. I mean, we're sitting in our hotel room in Kazakhstan, you know, watching the replays of the World Trade Center, and I mean, we're you know, supposedly hardcore SF guys, and I mean, we're crying watching it. I mean, we wanted to get into Afghanistan and we wanted to make things right. And to me, what was so incredible about the beginning days of Operation Enduring Freedom was, I mean, September 11th, we were attacked. Afghanistan was considered a country that you know, nobody should set foot in. And by December 5th, the Taliban surrendered and were on the run. I mean, everything that's happened since then is another story. But it's still with so much pride that I think of what all those men did over there, what J.D., Dan, and Cody died doing over there. I mean, it really was Special Forces at its best.